Copy. Copy. Hello, bruvs. We're back with Popular Entertainment Through the Ages by Samuel McKechnie, a Benjamin Blom book from 1969. At least that's when it was reissued. I think the original was 40s or 50s. Control V. Chapter 1. Oh no, buddy. Oh no. Chapter 1. Shit. No, I'm gonna try to go without the. I don't think it's gonna work though. New playlist. Popular entertainments through the ages, bruvs. We got that saved. Open the chatty. Mimes, minstrels, and strolling players. Tried to do this last night, but wannabe gangster across the street was yelling at somebody, dropping N-bombs every 2 seconds, so I halted, as anybody should. Make sure this is coming through clearly. Looks like it is. Make sure this is coming through clearly. Looks like it is. Alright. This is coming through clearly. Get rid of the echo. Pause this bullshit, and then we'll get started with this. Popular entertainments through the ages. Mimes, minstrels, and strolling players. 1. In the 6th century, the barbarians closed the Roman theaters, amphitheaters, and circuses. The dispossessed entertainers became wanderers. On the face of the earth, unrespected wanderers, looked down on by their audiences and pursued by the relentless hostility of the church. For several centuries, the church had been vigorously denouncing the popular entertainments. Thanks, buddy. You too. For several centuries, the church had been vigorously denouncing the popular entertainments, and not without cause. In the amphitheaters and circuses, gladiators fought to the death and faced lions and other wild beasts. Performances of the most degenerate nature took place in the theaters. Strictures and excommunications were unavailing. The degenerate Romans adhered to their love of brutal and licentious entertainments. Then came the northern barbarians. They despised the pleasures of the Romans, but as a sop to the vanquished, they allowed them to continue. Before very long, they suppressed them. The mimes took to the road. In the marketplace or wherever they could gather a crowd, 2 or 3 of the mimes would entertain their public with songs, stories, dances, juggling tricks, acrobatics, clowning, the exhibition of bears, and such like eternal amusements. They found their way into castles. Sometimes they sheltered for the night in the outhouses of farms, and often, like true vagabonds, they slept in the open air. Before the mime began to tramp the roads, the English and other Teutonic tribes had their scop, gleemen, or gleeman. The gleeman, however, was not a dancer, juggler, clown, or teller of obscene stories, nor were his audiences degenerate Romans. They were warlike barbarians, and accompanying himself on the harp, the gleeman sang to them the praise of heroes. His lays were the history and the literature of the tribe. Kings and warriors listened to him and took part in the singing, and his poems were on their lips as they went into battle. The common people knew his songs and sang them at their feasts, each in his turn as they passed round the harp. He held land and was the equal of Thanes. Thanes? I don't know what that is. The life of a gleeman is sketched in the Anglo-Saxon poem Widsith, the Far Traveller, which is almost certainly the earliest of all English poems, and which itself was the work of a gleeman. In the 4th century, Widsith, a member of the Myrging tribe, which dwelt between the Elbe and the Eider, visited and was made welcome by the Picts, Scots, Finns, Huns, Franks, Lombards, Romans, Hebrews, Egyptians, Indians, and Medes and Persians. The Ostrogoth Hermanric presented him with a collar of gold from Guthir, the Burgundian. The Burgundian he received a ring. And what's that mean? From Guthir, I see. From Guthir the Burgundian he received a ring. And on his return home to the land of the Myrgings, he was given an estate. The story finishes with a note in praise of the life of the gleeman. I have fared through many strange lands, says the singer. Good and evil have I known, but the wandering gleemen are always welcomed and have joy in their art. When in the 5th century the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain as conquerors, they brought with them their gleemen. From the lips of one of these entertainers of our forefathers, someone who could write, took down, about the year 700, the epic of Beowulf, and with later additions in the shape of both pagan and Christian passages, a manuscript of Beowulf written AD 1000 is still in existence. One can picture a gleeman striking the strings of his harp and singing the story to warriors who are gathered together in the hall of a king, or a Saxon of lesser rank entertaining his companions with it at a feast of the common people. Beowulf, the nephew of a Scandinavian king, sails with 14 companions to the Danish court, the inhabitants of which are being terrorized by Grendel, a powerful monster in human shape. Grendel used nightly to enter the mead hall, Hirot, pardon for these butchery of words, and slaughter the sleepers. Let me read that again. Grendel used nightly to enter the mead hall, Hirot, and slaughter the sleepers, and because of their great fear, none of them had used the hall for 12 years. Beowulf and his comrades, however, feast in the hall with the Danes, who then leave them to spend the night there. When all the warriors save Beowulf are asleep, the monster smites the great doors in with a single blow, tears one of the sleepers to shreds, and devours him. Beowulf, unarmed because he knows that the monster is charmed against all weapons, grapples with Grendel and mortally wounds him by tearing his arm from his shoulder. Grendel escapes, and the next day they follow his blood-stained track, which leads through the waste to a mere. Not a mirror, but a mere. The mother of the slain monster comes to the hall for revenge when the Danish king and his nobles are sleeping there, kills one of them and carries him off. Beowulf has been passing the night elsewhere. They go to the mere, and arming himself, Beowulf plunges into the blood-red water. He fights with the monster in a vault under the water and kills her. Seeing the corpse of Grendel, he cuts off the head and brings it to the king. The king rewards him richly, and honors are heaped upon him by the rulers of his own land, to which he returns and of which, in the course of time, he becomes king. The land prospers under his rule for 50 years. Then comes a fiery dragon and lays much of it waste. Beowulf, with 11 chosen warriors, goes to the dragon's lair, an ancient burial mound. The devastator rushes forth, and Beowulf faces it, aged and alone. His warriors, whom he had told to retire, are terrified by its fearsomeness and seek safety in flight, all but one, who helps Beowulf to slay the dragon. Before it is vanquished, however, it wounds the king to death. The body of Beowulf is burned to ashes on a funeral pile. His ashes are buried in a huge mound which, following his instructions, his sorrowing subjects have erected on a high cliff, where it can be seen by those who sail on the misty sea. 12 of his warriors then ride round the burial place, extolling his character as a warrior and a ruler. The warlike pagans who composed and sang, or who listened to stories such as Beowulf, became Christians in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. Besides making the singers more pacific, the change opened up to them new realms of fancy. Many of the stories told by the gleemen were definitely religious, repeating biblical narratives or recording the lives of saints. Alfred and other pious people took a delight in them. As a boy at his mother's knee, Alfred joyed in learning Old English songs. When king, he still learned and sang them, pagan as well as Christian. He taught them to his own children, had them taught in his schools, and aroused the interest of his nobles in them. Yet the church frowned upon the gleeman. A likely reason for this is advanced by Sir E.K. Chambers, who suggests that it is probable that there had set in a degeneration of the Teutonic gleeman. The gleeman, singer of lofty themes and player of the harp, had come into contact with the mime, who catered for the lower taste of humanity by juggling, dancing, tumbling, and telling obscene stories. From the combination of mime and gleeman emerged in the 11th century the jongleur. This unhonored entertainer was called joggler in Provence, where he first appeared, and we get from the word juggler. 2. In the ranks of the jongleurs, there were two broad types, corresponding to the gleeman and the mime. The mime type found their audiences among the lower classes. Those who approximated to the gleeman entertained the nobility and the gentry. In both the north and the south of France, the latter type were the first to compose poetry in the vernacular which had developed from the Latin tongue spoken by the common people. As in England, so in France, the oldest poetry in the language of the nation was composed and sung by wandering entertainers. Let's take a look at this. What is this? A Roman circus. There was no clear-cut distinction between the two types of jongleur, such as exist today between the street corner and the drawing room entertainer, because there was no marked difference between the tastes of the various classes of audience. The noble in his castle and the peasant in his cottage shared pretty evenly in the uncultivated manners of the age. There's a jongleurice or glee maiden. And what are these? Roman equilibrists. Try to get that. There we go. Take the glare off it. Before very long, the jongleurs, with no position in society, found themselves rivaled by a class of wandering entertainer, which was mainly composed of persons of noble or gentle birth, although some of its members were born of the common people. This was the troubadour, called in the north of France, England, and elsewhere, the trouvère. The troubadour was not very clearly differentiated from the jongleur. Some of the jongleurs, like the troubadours, composed and sang poems. and like the jongleurs, many of the troubadours accepted payment, even stooping to threats or fulsome praise in order to obtain largesse. In time, however, the jongleurs as a class were reduced to a subordinate position by the superior wealth, social status, and accomplishments of the troubadours. They either attended a troubadour on his travels or spread abroad his musical and poetical productions, which were written essentially for aristocrats. The first troubadour of whom anything definite is known was the licentious William, Count of Poitiers and Duke of Aquitaine, who was born in 1701. Most of the others were also of exalted rank, including Richard I, who composed some lays of considerable beauty and who was a liberal patron of minstrelsy. One minstrel who benefited from his generosity was Blondel, and a very interesting, although apocryphal, story is told of how he showed his gratitude. The king was taken prisoner when returning across Europe from a crusade, and his whereabouts was unknown. Blondel set out to find him. He wandered from place to place on the continent, and eventually he learned that in a castle on the Danube, there was a carefully guarded prisoner. He tried to find out by bribery the name of the prisoner, but could only ascertain that he was in the habit of coming to a narrow window high up in the castle. After waiting and watching, Blondel found that he could not see the face of him who looked through the window. So he sang part of a song which had been composed by Richard and himself, and the voice which finished the song was that of the troubadour king. That's a pretty cool story. Or bullocks, but the story of Luc de Barre shows that the troubadours did not always have cause to be grateful to kings and indicates one of the directions in which they exercised their talents. This luckless Norman singer fell into the hands of Henry I, who said, Luc de Barre has never done me homage, but he has fought against me. He has composed facetiously indecent songs upon me. He has sung them openly to my prejudice, and often raised the hoarse laughs of my malignant enemies against me. The king then ordered that the eyes of the troubadour should be pulled out. In order to escape from this punishment, the prisoner rushed against the wall and dashed out his brains. The troubadours composed music and played it, wrote lyrics and sang them. Their favorite subjects were love, war, politics, and personal satire. Among the warm-blooded singers of Provence, the stress was laid emphatically on love. Each troubadour possessed a lady love whose beauty and other charms were the subject of many of his poems. From castle to castle he spread her fame, and there was intense rivalry for the honor of being pangerized. This rivalry made conquest easy for the troubadour, whether the latest fair one to catch his gallant eye was single or married. And, as in general, neither the troubadour nor the ladies cared as much for morality as for pleasure. Illicit relationships were over plentiful. On the other hand, the troubadours exercised a beneficent influence upon all classes of society by fostering a love of poetry and music. Most of the secular poetry and music, and no small part of the religious poetry of the Middle Ages, was produced by minstrels. To use a term which embraces trouvères, and all types of jongleurs as well as troubadours. As the audiences of the troubadours had no Latin education, they had been cut off from literature until songs and poems in their own language were brought into their very households by minstrels. Many troubadours took with them on their travels from castle to castle 2 or 3 jongleurs. The master rode on horseback and the attendants followed on foot, often playing his music on their instruments and singing the poems which he had written. When the gay company was near a castle, one of the jongleurs would hasten to announce the coming of the troubadour. The drawbridge was lowered, and the troubadour found the inhabitants of the castle waiting to welcome him. For in those days there were few sources of entertainment, and a visit from a troubadour often meant several days' amusement. The troubadour was given a place of honor at the heavily laden table. While the company was feasting upon boars' heads and flagons, the jongleurs, at a signal from their master, broke into an occasional merry time. In many cases, the hall contained a special minstrel's gallery. Early the following day, the jongleurs made music on the ramparts overlooking the moat, while knights and ladies took their morning stroll. In the afternoon, they gave a performance in a neighboring meadow to the inhabitants of the castle and the nobility and gentry of the district. In these pleasant surroundings, and in the presence of a distinguished gathering, the troubadour displayed his talent as poet, singer, composer, and musician. But being a star performer, he did not give his audiences any more entertainment than was necessary. As Sir Harry Lauder has put it, to leave them with their mouths watering. The bulk of the program was provided by the attendant jongleurs. The jongleurs were adept at many things, says a typical member of the profession in an old manuscript. I can play the lute, the violin, the bagpipe, the syrinx, the harp, the gigue, the gigu, I don't know how to say that, the gigue, the gittern, the symphony, the psaltery, the organistrum, the regals, the tabor, and the rote. I can sing a song well and make tales and fables. I can tell a story against any man. I can make love verses to please young ladies, and can play the gallant for them if necessary. Then I can throw knives into the air and catch them without cutting my fingers. I can do dodges with string, most extraordinary and amusing. I can balance chairs and make tables dance. I can throw a somersault and walk on my head. Others imitated the songs of birds with their voices, jumped through four hoops, danced, and performed tricks of legerdemain. I don't know how to say that. Legerdemain. The sterner side of the nature of the troubadours and jongleurs and their interest not only in love, nor in poems of war, but in battle itself, was shown when the Normans faced the Saxons at Senlac. A jongler of social standing, Taillefer, the cleaver of iron, craved and obtained from William of Normandy the honor of being the first to strike a blow in the battle. As the army advanced up Senlac Hill to meet the forces of the last of the Saxon kings, Taillefer rode at the head, singing of Roland and Charlemagne. Wace, an Anglo-Norman minstrel of the 12th century, describes the scene in his Roman de Rue, and among the translators of the passage is Sir Walter Scott. Taillefer, who sung both well and loud, came mounted on a courser proud. Before the Duke the minstrel sprung, and loud of Charles and Roland sung, of Oliver and champions Mo, who died at fatal Roncevaux. Taillefer, as he galloped singing to the charge, threw his sword time and again into the air and caught it by the handle as it came down. Before he fell in the battle, he slew 2 English warriors of distinction. After the conquest, the castles of the land being occupied by French-speaking Normans instead of Englishmen were no longer the resort of the Anglo-Saxon minstrel. He became a wanderer, and to his oppressed compatriots he sang the old songs and sagas of England, perhaps even the ancient story of Beowulf, and he celebrated in verse the fight against the Normans put up in the fens by Hereward the Wake. Sometimes he sang openly in streets and village fairs. A welcome was extended to him by the English franklins, some of whom kept their own household minstrel or jester. Sir Walter Scott described Wamba, who had taken his appropriated seat upon a chair, the back of which was decorated with 2 asses' ears, and which was placed about 2 steps behind that of his master, who from time to time supplied him with victuals from his own trencher, a favor, however, which the jester shared with the favorite dogs, of whom there were several in attendance. Here sat Wamba with a small table before him, his heels tucked up against the bar of the chair, his cheeks sucked up, so as to make his jaws resemble a pair of nutcrackers, and his eyes half shut, yet watching with alertness every opportunity to exercise his licensed foolery. Let's check this out. Albert Powell, who has performed at Bertram W. Mills's Circus, Olympia, in his contortionist trapeze act. A 14th century contortionist. Anglo-Saxon jugglers. Animal mimics of the Middle Ages, and bottom left a trained dog. Performing animals of the 13th century. That's a crazy looking dog. What kind of hell dog is that? It looks like a bear. There is very little trace of the Anglo-Saxon minstrel after the 12th century. By the 14th century, the mingling of the two races was complete, and the much altered English tongue being the language of all classes, the English minstrel came into his own. For the wandering minstrels of the mime tradition, Normans or Saxons, the life was hard. In their travels, they had to face all the rigors of the English climate. Even when wet, footsore, hungry, and penniless, on their arrival at a village, they had to tell their merry jests, cut amusing capers, and in other ways known to wandering entertainers, since the earliest days draw the coins from ill-lined pockets. They turned somersaults, twisted themselves into fantastic shapes, juggled with knives, swallowed them, and ate blazing tow. One of their business methods, like the items in their program, is still in use at street corners, as will be done today when one of their descendants is about to make his escape from the stout rope with which any member of the audience has bound him and make a hat collection. Some minstrels of the lower class added to the attractiveness of the show by traveling about with glee maidens who sang, played musical instruments, danced, and even did acrobatic tricks. One or two of the more hardy and daring of the glee maidens would set out on their own. In the higher ranks were glee maidens like Adeline, who received an estate from William the Conqueror, Josiane, who sang to Sir Bevis of Southampton, and most famous of all, Marie de France. Marie flourished in the later part of the 12th century and lived at court. Henry II is thought to be the unnamed king to whom she dedicated a collection of lays. She set to verse fables from English originals and translated from the Latin a story of the St. Patrick into French, of course, as this was the language of the ruling class. The lays of this gifted glee maiden were sung in all the castles of the land and were especially enjoyed by the ladies. Very freely translated by Arthur O'Shaughnessy. One of her songs begins, "Hath any loved you well down there, summer or winter through? Down there have you found any fair, laid in the grave with you? Is death's long kiss a richer kiss than mine was wont to be? Or have you gone to some far bliss and quite forgotten me?" The usual type of entertainment in the castles was, however, of a more robust nature than that provided by the lays of Marie de France. At a night dubbing, betrothal, wedding, or baptism, an amazing number and variety of minstrels would sometimes be gathered together. Musicians were present with their harps, bagpipes, lutes, sets of bells, trumpets, drums, violins, cymbals, tabors, dulcimers, flageolets, and many other instruments. Others juggled with knives and balls. The spectators were mystified by the sleight of hand tricks of minstrels who professed to use magic. Contortionists twisted themselves into impossible shapes. Acrobats, including women, balanced chairs and tables, threw somersaults, walked on their heads, leaped through hoops, balanced themselves in dangerous positions, and risked their necks by performing daring feats on the tightrope. Punch and Judy shows were not then in existence, but other puppets or marionettes were manipulated by the minstrels. Outside the court, there would be a sound of barking. Hold on. Braying or some other animal noise, and appropriately masked, minstrels would come in and add to the boisterous merriment. Animal trainers appeared with dogs, cocks, hares, horses, bears, camels, and even lions. Tricks were performed by some of the animals. Others, such as the camels and lions, were exhibited as natural curiosities, for the spectators were less well acquainted than we are today with the appearance of exotic beasts. Occasionally, a special thrill would be added to the entertainment by a fight between a minstrel and a bear or a lion. As regards the bear, although the words were written later, one may recall here Ben Jonson's description of the entry of a bear ward to a merrymaking. Very sufficient bears, says Slug, and can dance at first sight and play their own tunes if need be. John Urson, the bear ward, offers to play them, with any city dancers christened for a ground measure. Notch adds, marry for lofty tricks or dancing on the ropes he will not undertake. It is out of their element. While the bears are dancing, John Urson sings a ballad which begins, though it may seem rude for me to intrude with these my bears, by chance, 'twere sport for a king if they could sing as well as they can dance, So we got what, 18 more pages? Probably try to read at least to page 14. 4. Many of the minstrels were conjurers. These entertainers probably reached their greatest popularity in the 14th century when they were known as trigateurs. Some of their tricks were generally attributed to an understanding between the performer and the devil. This view being held by Janus or James the First. Janus would have been better. Accordingly, the trigators were frequently classed with magicians, sorcerers, and witches. They often traveled about in companies, and it is to be assumed that they carried with them the various contrivances necessary for the performance of tricks which did not depend upon the most precious accomplishment of the conjurer, then as today, sleight of hand. In the Frankenland's tale, Chaucer describes some of the tricks. Among them were the appearance in a hall of water and a barge, a lion, flowers, a vine, a castle of lime and stone, all of which vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. For oft at feast have I well heard say that trigators within an hall large have mad come in a water and a barge, and in the hall rowing up and down. Sometime hath seemed come a grim leon, and sometimes floors spring as in a mead, sometime a vine, and grapes white and reed, sometimes a castle, all of lime and stone, and what hem liked voided it anon. Thus seemed it to every man's sight. He also tells how there appeared wild deer, some being slain by arrows, and some killed by the hounds. Falconers were seen on the bank of a river, where the birds pursued herons and slew them. Knights jousted on a plain. The amazed spectator saw himself dancing with his lady. Down of his horse Aurelius light anon, and forth with this magician is he gone, whom to his house and made hem well as hem lacked no victual that might hem please, so well a raised house as there was own. Aurelius in his life sought never noon. He shrewd him ere he went to supper. Forest park is full of wild deer. There saw he hurts with his hornus high, the greatest that ever were seen with eye. He sought of him 100 slain with hounds, and some with ours bleed of bitter wounds. He saw von voided ver these wild deer, these falconers upon a fair river, that with her hawks on the heron slain, those so he knights justing in a plain. And after this he died him switch pleasance, that he him showed his lady on a dance, and which himself he danced, as him thought, and won this meister, that this magic rout, saw it was time, he clapped his hands too, and farewell, all our revel was ago, and yet removed they never out of the house, while they saw all this sight marvelous. Old English is awful. These were undoubtedly magic lantern effects, yet the lantern itself is usually thought to have been invented by Athenaeus Kircher in the middle of the 17th century. The explanation, however, is that in the 14th century there were glass lenses which gave good telescopic and microscopic effects. In an Elizabethan morality play, a servant describing the sports at his master's wedding mentioned other tricks which were of a cruder nature. The art had fallen on evil days. Nevertheless, the tricks he talked of were ancient, and similar ones are met with even today. There was the thrusting of knives through many a nose, and the putting of botkins through leg and hose. In 1930s, let's say 1930. In 1931, a colored man in a booth at Mr. Bertram Mills's Olympia Fun Fair drove a nail deep into the back of his hand. How the latter trick was done does not matter, but details of the earlier tricks were, were explained in what was probably one of the first English books on the subject of conjuring. The 17th century Hocus Pocus Jr., The Anatomy of Legerdemain, or the Art of Juggling. By looking for a minute or two at some of the contents of the book, we shall be able to form a mental picture of medieval performances of the same description. The conjurer mentions the qualifications which were necessary in his profession, and modern textbooks on the subject, written when the art has developed beyond the wildest dreams of the earlier practitioners, stress the very same points. Even the strange terms have not fallen into disuse. For the conjurer of today, hocus pocuses the spectators by telling them that the quickness of the hand deceives the eye, when he knows better than they do that it does nothing of the kind. He is merely following out part of the instructions given in the pamphlet. First, he must be one of an impudent and audacious spirit, so that he may set a good face upon the matter. Secondly, he must have a nimble and cleanly conveyance. Thirdly, he must have strange terms and emphatical words to grace and adorn his actions, and the more to astonish the beholders. Fourthly and lastly, such gestures of body as may lead away the spectator's eyes from a strict and diligent beholding of his manner of conveyance. He describes the method of working the delightful old trick of cutting one's nose half off. For the effecting of this feat, you must have a knife for the nonce, made with a gap in the midst of the blade. The gap he refers to is like the one you would cause if you could perform the feat of biting a piece out of a blade. The blade. You must conceal an inch with your finger, and then ring it over the fleshy part of your nose, and your nose will seem as if it were half cut off. Jesus Christ. And then ring it over the fleshy part of your nose, and your nose will seem as if it were half cut off with the knife. Note that in such feats as this, it were necessary to have a piece of sponge with some sheep's blood in it to be retained privately. Other tricks that he explained were how to seem to thrust a bodkin through your forehead, how to seem to put a ring, furrow one's cheeks, how to seem to eat a knife, how to cut off a man's head, this being called the decollation of John Baptiste. How to draw ribbons of any color out of your mouth and to deliver it by the yard, how to seem to pull a rope through your nose, and undoubtedly a very popular trick with conjurers, for there was no deception about the finishing part of it, how to vanish a glass of beer. That's going to be all for now, bruv. Popular entertainments through the ages.